The courtroom buzzed with an electric hum, a hive of restless energy that seemed to vibrate through the polished wooden benches and up into the high ceiling. The air hung thick, heavy with the weight of anticipation, as every eye fixed on Judge Ethan Carter. He sat behind the towering bench, his black robe draped over his broad shoulders like a mantle of authority, his dark skin glistening faintly under the harsh fluorescent lights. His hands, steady despite the storm brewing inside him, rested on the gavel as he prepared to deliver a verdict that would carve a jagged line through the fragile unity of this fractured community. Across from him, Sergeant David Barnes occupied the defendant's table, his posture rigid, his pale blue eyes glinting with a cold, unyielding defiance. The man's uniform, crisp, adorned with badges of honor, seemed almost a mockery now, a costume worn by someone who'd long forgotten its meaning. Behind him, rows of fellow officers lined the gallery. Their faces a gallery of stone statues, each one etched with loyalty to their brother-in-arms. Their crossed arms and clenched jaws spoke louder than words. They stood with Barnes, no matter the cost. On the opposite side of the aisle, the victim's family sat huddled together, a tight knot of humanity clinging to one another for strength. Their hands trembled as they gripped each other's fingers, their eyes wide with a fragile blend of hope and dread. The mother, her face lined with years of worry, whispered prayers under her breath, while her teenage son stared at Ethan with a desperate intensity, as if the judge held the key to mending the broken pieces of their lives. The room pulsed with murmurs, a low rumble of voices that swelled and faded like waves against a rocky shore, until Ethan's voice sliced through it all, sharp and commanding as a blade drawn from its sheath. After a thorough review of the evidence presented before this court, he began, his tone measured yet resonant. I find Sergeant David Barnes guilty of excessive force and the egregious violation of civil rights. The words detonated like a bomb in the crowded space. Gasps erupted from the gallery, sharp and jagged, followed by a rising tide of outrage. A cluster of officers in the back shot to their feet, their faces twisted into masks of fury. This is a disgrace, one bellowed, his voice booming off the walls like a gunshot. His uniform strained against his broad chest as he thrust a fist into the air, his eyes blazing with indignation. The others around him nodded, their murmurs growing into a chorus of dissent that threatened to drown out the proceedings. Ethan's gavel came down with a thunderous crack, the sound reverberating through the chamber like a judge's decree from on high. Order, he commanded, his deep voice cutting through the chaos with the force of a storm breaking. The room fell into a brittle, uneasy silence, though the tension coiled tighter, a snake ready to strike. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering as he fixed it on Barnes. As an officer sworn to uphold the law, your duty was to protect and serve the people of this community. Instead, you chose to wield your authority as a weapon, abusing the trust placed in you. This court cannot, will not, tolerate such betrayal of justice. His eyes locked with Barnes's, two forces colliding in a silent battle of wills. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison. The verdict hung in the air, heavy and final, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. One officer muttered a curse under his breath, the words barely audible but dripping with venom. Another spat on the floor, a deliberate act of contempt as he stormed toward the exit, his boots pounding the polished wood like a war drum. The gallery erupted once more, a cacophony of shouts and jeers, forcing the bailiffs to step forward, their hands hovering near their holsters as they barked orders for calm. Ethan remained a pillar of composure atop the bench, though beneath his robe, his chest tightened with the weight of what he'd just unleashed. He could feel it, the ripple of this moment spreading outward, far beyond these walls. Barnes rose slowly, the clink of his handcuffs a metallic chime that punctuated the chaos. He turned to face Ethan, his lips curling into a sneer that bared his teeth like a predator sizing up its prey. You think this is over? He hissed, his voice low and laced with menace. each word dripping with a promise of retribution. "You'll pay for this, Carter. Mark my words." The victim's family flinched at the threat. The mother's hand flying to her mouth as a stifled gasp escaped her lips. Ethan met Barnes's glare head-on, his expression carved from granite. "Threats won't alter the truth, Sergeant. Justice has spoken, and it will not be silenced." Two bailiffs flanked Barnes, their grips firm as they escorted him from the courtroom. His head remained high, his stride deliberate. As if he were a king being led to exile rather than a convict bound for a cell. Ethan watched him go, his face a mask of resolve, though inside, a flicker of unease stirred. Barnes's words clung to him like damp fog, seeping into his thoughts as the courtroom began to empty. The murmur of dissent among the departing officers grew louder, spilling into the hallways like a rising tide. "This is a witch hunt," one barked, his voice rough with anger as he shoved past a reporter scribbling notes. "Barnes didn't deserve this, he's one of us." Another added, his tone bitter as he adjusted the badge on his chest. "Carter's trying to make an example out of us, but he'll see what happens when you cross the line." The uproar crescendoed as a knot of officers cornered Ethan in the corridor outside the courtroom. He'd barely stepped into the hallway, his security detail trailing close, when a burly figure blocked his path. "Judge Carter," the officer snapped, his fist clenched so tightly his knuckles gleamed white. "You've turned your back on the people who keep this city safe." The man's face was flushed red, his breath hot with fury. Around him, his colleagues pressed closer, their hostility a palpable heat that seemed to close in on Ethan from all sides. His security team stepped forward, forming a human shield, but Ethan raised a hand to halt them. He straightened, his voice calm yet edged with steel. "Upholding the law means holding everyone accountable, no exceptions. Not even those who wear a badge. Justice doesn't bend for loyalty." The officers didn't retreat. One, younger than the rest, pointed a trembling finger at Ethan, his voice a low growl. "You're going to regret this, Your Honor." The threat lingered as a colleague tugged him back, muttering something about keeping cool. Ethan's detail ushered him away, their movements swift and practiced as they guided him through the courthouse's echoing halls and out into the fading daylight. Outside, a chaotic scene unfolded, protesters and supporters clashed in a sea of noise, their voices a jumbled roar. Some cheered Ethan's name, waving signs that praised the verdict as a triumph for equality. Others brandished placards denouncing him as a traitor to law enforcement, their shouts laced with venom. The car waiting for him gleamed under the late afternoon sun, a black sanctuary amidst the storm. As it pulled away, the chants followed, a discordant symphony of anger and approval that faded into the hum of the engine. Ethan stared out the tinted window, his reflection a ghostly outline against the passing streets. For a fleeting moment, he let his shoulders sag, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Justice had prevailed today. But the victory felt hollow, overshadowed by the certainty of battles yet to come. Barnes's venomous glare haunted him, a specter that refused to fade. He knew this verdict would send shockwaves far beyond the courtroom, but the true depth of the danger lurking ahead remained a shadow he couldn't yet grasp. The slam of the car door echoed through the quiet suburban street as Ethan stepped onto his driveway. The tension of the day clung to him like a second skin, a weight that pressed against his chest with every step. His house stood before him, its warm yellow glow spilling from the windows like a promise of refuge. Inside, the faint drone of the evening news mingled with the scratch of a pencil on paper. Noah, his 12-year-old son, hunched over the kitchen table, his brow furrowed as he wrestled with algebra. Sophia met Ethan in the hallway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression a storm cloud ready to break. "How was it?" she asked, her voice clipped, though the tightness in her jaw suggested she'd already pieced together the answer from the snippets she'd caught on TV. Ethan sighed. shrugging off his coat and hanging it on the rack with deliberate care. The verdict's in. It's done. His words were heavy, each one landing like a stone dropped into still water. It's not done. Sophia shot back, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. You saw that crowd outside the courthouse. You heard the threats. This isn't over, Ethan, not by a long shot. Her dark eyes flashed with a mix of fear and frustration, emotions she'd been bottling up all day as she watched the news unfold. Before Ethan could respond, Noah lifted his head from his homework. His young face creased with worry. Dad, I saw some of it on TV. Those people, they looked so angry. His voice trembled slightly. The innocence in his tone clashing with the weight of what he'd witnessed. Ethan crossed the room in 3 strides, resting a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. Sometimes, Noah. Doing what's right stirs up anger. But that doesn't mean we stop. It means we keep going. Sophia let out a scoff, the sound slicing through the tender moment like a shard of glass. And what about us, Ethan? What about the people who have to live with the fallout of your choices? You're not the only one they're coming after. Her words hung between them, thick with accusation. The air in the room grew taut, a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Ethan turned to face her, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of strain. You think I don't know that? You think I don't lie awake every night wondering what this means for you, for Noah? I feel it every second, Sophia. Then why not let someone else take this on, she pressed. Her eyes blazing as she stepped closer. Why drag us into a war that doesn't belong to us? We're not soldiers, Ethan, we're your family. Her voice cracked, betraying the fear she'd tried so hard to mask. Because if everyone stepped back, there'd be no justice left to fight for, he countered, his tone rising with conviction. This isn't just about Barnes. It's about what's right, for Noah's future, for everyone's. Noah's small voice broke through the escalating clash, timid yet piercing. Mom, Dad, there's a car outside. Both parents froze, their heads snapping toward him. What? Ethan asked, already moving toward the window, his pulse quickening. Noah pointed a shaky finger toward the driveway. It's been there a while. Someone's in it. I think they're taking pictures. Ethan parted the curtain just enough to peer out. His stomach lurching at the sight of a dark sedan parked across the street. The faint glow of a phone screen illuminated a shadowy figure inside, their movements deliberate and unsettling. Stay here, he ordered, grabbing his phone from his pocket. Sophia trailed him, her voice tight with panic. What are you doing? Calling the police, he replied, his fingers dialing with swift precision. This isn't a coincidence. As he relayed the situation to the dispatcher, the sedan's headlights suddenly blazed to life, the engine roaring as it peeled away, tires screeching against the asphalt. The sound faded into the night, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. They're gone, Ethan muttered, lowering the phone, though his grip remained tight. Sophia's voice quivered. A mix of anger and terror spilling out. This is what I've been saying, Ethan. They're watching us now. This isn't just threats, it's real. She hugged her arms around herself, as if trying to hold the pieces of her fraying composure together. He faced her, his expression resolute yet softened by the sight of her fear. And what do you want me to do, Sophia? Back down? Let them think they can scare us into silence? Yes, she snapped, tears welling in her eyes as her voice broke. If it means keeping this family safe, then yes, Ethan. I want you to back down. I want you to choose us, just this once. Her words struck him like a physical blow, each one a plea wrapped in desperation. Noah stood in the doorway, his small frame dwarfed by the tension filling the room. His eyes darted between his parents, wide and anxious, as if he could feel the world shifting beneath his feet. Ethan's voice softened as he met his wife's gaze. "I am choosing us, Sophia. By standing up now, I'm making sure people like Barnes don't get to do this again, not to Noah, not to anyone. That's what I'm fighting for." She shook her head, her voice breaking into a whisper. "How do I protect Noah from what's coming, Ethan? How do I protect myself?" Tears spilled down her cheeks, carving glistening trails against her skin. "You won't have to," he said, stepping closer, his hand reaching for hers. "I'll protect you. That's my job, my promise." She pulled away, her shoulders trembling as she turned her face from him. "You can't promise that," she murmured, the truth in her words a quiet dagger that silenced him. The weight of his decisions bore down harder than ever, a crushing force that threatened to buckle his resolve. From the doorway, Noah spoke again, his voice steady despite its softness. "Dad. What if they come back?" Ethan crouched to meet his son's eyes, searching the boy's face for courage he hoped he'd instilled. "Then we'll be ready, Noah. And we'll face it together." As the Carter family braced for the uncertain days ahead, a different scene unfolded in the dimly lit break room of the 7th Precinct. The air was stale, thick with the scent of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke that lingered despite the no-smoking signs. A cluster of officers gathered close, their voices hushed but sharp, a conspiratorial edge threading through their words. At the center stood Sergeant David Barnes, temporarily freed on bail, his presence a dark magnet drawing the others in. His broad shoulders filled the space, his uniform traded for a plain jacket that did little to diminish his air of command. "We've been thrown under the bus," he growled, his voice thick with venom, each syllable a spark igniting the room. "All of us. And it's because of that damn judge." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group, heads nodding as Barnes scanned their faces, some weathered by years on the force, others still fresh with the idealism he intended to stamp out. Officer Luke Harris leaned against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his gaze fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. He'd served under Barnes for years, admired the man's unyielding leadership, but now, something in Barnes's tone twisted his gut into knots. The sergeant's lips curled into a sinister smile, a predator baring its fangs. "Carter thinks he can sit up there on his high horse and tear down everything we've built. But we're not going to let him. We make his life hell, surveillance, intimidation, whatever it takes. He needs to know he made a mistake crossing us. His family isn't off limits either. People need to learn there are consequences." Luke straightened, his jaw tightening as the words sank in. "Hold up." He interrupted, his voice cutting through the low hum of agreement. Every head swiveled toward him, eyes narrowing as if he'd just stepped out of line. "You're talking about going after his family? That's crossing a line, Sarge." His heart pounded, a mix of loyalty and disgust warring within him as he met Barnes's steely gaze. The room held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Barnes tilted his head, his smile fading into something colder, more dangerous. "You're either with us, Harris, or you're against us. Which is it?" The question hung like a guillotine. And Luke felt the weight of every eye upon him, the unspoken lesson clear: power abused unchecked breeds chaos, and justice, though hard-won, demands a price from all who stand in its path. The air in the precinct locker room hung heavy, thick with unspoken accusations and the faint metallic tang of rust from the aging lockers. Officer Luke Harris stood rigid, his chest rising and falling with barely contained fury, as Line Barnes turned toward him, his movements deliberate, almost predatory. Barnes's eyes narrowed into slits, his weathered face hardening as he sized up his subordinate. "You got a problem, Harris?" His voice was low, gravelly, laced with a challenge that dared Luke to step over an invisible line. Luke's jaw tightened, his pulse hammering in his ears. He took a bold step forward, boots scuffing against the chipped linoleum floor, his resolve hardening like steel. "Yeah, I do," he said. His tone unwavering, cutting through the stifling atmosphere. "This isn't about protecting the badge anymore, Barnes. This is personal. You're dragging us all into a pit we won't climb out of, some twisted vendetta that's going to destroy everything we've worked for." His words carried the weight of a man who'd spent years believing in the sanctity of their oath, only to watch it erode before his eyes. From the shadowed corner of the room, Officer Dean, a grizzled veteran with deep lines etched into his face from decades of hard choices, stepped forward. His presence was a quiet storm. His voice taut with tension as he positioned himself between the two men. "Watch your mouth, Harris," he warned, his tone sharp but tinged with unease. "Barnes is doing what's gotta be done to keep this department standing." Dean's loyalty to Barnes was unspoken but palpable. A tether forged in years of shared battles, yet his eyes flickered with a hint of doubt, a crack in his otherwise stoic facade. Luke's gaze snapped to Dean, then back to Barnes. His frustration boiling over. "Necessary," he spat, his voice rising as he paced a tight circle, unable to contain the fire surging through him. "Stalking a judge? Threatening his kid? Since when does that fit into what we stand for?" The question hung in the air, sharp and accusatory, a plea for someone to remember the principles they'd once sworn to uphold. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls themselves bearing witness to the fracture splitting their ranks. Barnes didn't flinch. He closed the distance between them in 2 measured steps. His boots thudding against the floor, until their faces were mere inches apart. His breath was hot, his voice dropping to a hiss that carried the weight of a threat. "Since they decided we're the enemy, Harris. This isn't just about Carter. It's about showing every self-righteous bastard out there that we won't be torn down." His eyes burned with a cold, unrelenting fury, a man consumed by a mission that had long since morphed into something darker. Luke shook his head, disgust twisting his features as he met Barnes's glare. "You're blind, Dave. This isn't justice, it's revenge, pure and simple. You're so wrapped up in your own anger you can't even see it." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with the raw ache of betrayal. He'd looked up to Barnes once, seen him as a beacon of strength, but now that image lay shattered at his feet. Barnes leaned in closer, his whisper slicing through the tension like a blade. "You're either with us or against us, Harris. And you know damn well what happens to traitors." The words were a death knell, heavy with menace, and a low murmur of assent rippled through the room. Luke's eyes darted around, taking in the faces of his colleagues. Some nodded faintly, others averted their gazes, but all were complicit in their silence. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Too many were willing to follow Barnes down this abyss without a second thought. "I'm out," Luke declared. His voice steadied despite the inferno raging in his chest. He squared his shoulders, standing tall against the tide of hostility pressing in on him. "I'm not part of this." Barnes smirked. A cruel twist of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "That's a shame. But if you're not with us, you're nothing." With a flick of his hand, he gestured toward the door. A silent command laced with disdain. Luke didn't waver. He shoved past the cluster of officers, their shoulders brushing against his with deliberate force, and stormed out. His footsteps echoed in the cramped space, each one a declaration of defiance as he left the suffocating room behind. The moment he stepped into the dim hallway, the weight of their stares bore into his back like daggers, their whispers chasing him like ghosts. That evening, miles away, Ethan Carter sat in the quiet of his home. The soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the stillness. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting him from his thoughts. He picked it up. His heart sinking as he saw the message from his son, Noah, a photo of their garage door, now defaced with jagged red graffiti screaming, "Traitor," in accusing strokes. Ethan's fists clenched, knuckles widening as a storm of emotions swirled within him, anger at the violation, fear for his family, and a gnawing resolve to protect them at all costs. Before he could type a reply, his wife Sophia's voice cut through the haze, trembling with urgency. "Ethan, come here." He hurried into the living room, where Sophia stood frozen, her wide eyes locked on the television. The local news flickered across the screen, a shaky citizen-submitted video showing a dark sedan trailing Noah as he walked home from school, its headlights glinting ominously in the dusk. The anchor's voice droned on, clinical and detached, but to Ethan and Sophia, every word was a hammer blow. "They're escalating," Sophia whispered, her hands twisting together as panic crept into her tone. "This isn't just threats anymore." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight, a grim determination settling over him like armor. "I'll handle it," he said. Though the how eluded him in that moment. Meanwhile, Luke sat slumped in his car outside the precinct, the engine off, the night pressing in through the windows. His mind was a battlefield, torn between the ideals he'd clung to for years and the stark reality he'd just walked away from. The badge on his chest, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a lead weight dragging him under. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, as memories of camaraderie and purpose clashed with the corruption he'd witnessed. The passenger door creaked open, startling him. And Officer Dean slid into view, leaning casually against a nearby patrol car. He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the deep shadows under his eyes. "That was brave, Harris," Dean said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he exhaled a plume of smoke. "Sticking your neck out like that. Real noble." Luke stepped out, his movements cautious, every muscle coiled with tension. "What do you want, Dean?" The older officer took a long drag, the ember glowing red in the dark. "Just a friendly heads up," he replied, his tone deceptively light. "Barnes doesn't forgive. And he sure as hell doesn't forget. You'd better watch your back." The warning hung between them, heavy with unspoken consequences. And Dean's eyes held a flicker of pity, or perhaps regret, before he turned and disappeared into the night. The next day, the precinct buzzed with its usual chaos, radios crackling, footsteps echoing, but to Luke, it was a hollow shell. He moved through the hallways like a specter, the air thick with unspoken judgment. Every glance from his fellow officers was a shard of ice. Every whispered conversation a reminder of his exile. In the locker room, Barnes cornered him, his presence looming like a thundercloud. "You think you're better than us now?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt as he leaned in close, his breath sour with coffee and spite. Luke didn't back down, his own anger flaring. "I think you've lost sight of what's right, Dave. And I'm not sinking with you." Barnes's fist slammed into the locker beside Luke's head, the clang reverberating through the room like a gunshot. "Careful, Harris," he growled, his eyes narrowing to dangerous slits. "You're making enemies you can't afford." Luke held his ground, his voice low but resolute. "I'm done being afraid of you." Barnes stepped back, a predator sizing up prey, then delivered his parting shot. "Then you're done. Period." The words echoed as he stalked away, leaving Luke alone with the ringing silence and the dawning realization that this was only the beginning. Days later, the bell above the door of May's diner jingled sharply as Luke entered. His face a mask of stone, his uniform crisp despite the turmoil churning inside him. The usual chatter of the small-town eatery, forks clinking against plates. The soft murmur of gossip, stilled as patrons sensed the storm in his stride. His eyes zeroed in on Ryan Johnson, a young black man perched at the counter, scrolling idly on his phone while waiting for his meal. Luke approached, his boots striking the worn wooden floor with purpose, his shadow falling over Ryan like a dark omen. "ID," Luke said curtly. Standing too close, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Ryan looked up, confusion creasing his brow. "I'm sorry, what?" "ID," Luke repeated, sharper now. His hand hovering near his belt as if poised to escalate. "Let's see it." Ryan's posture stiffened, but his voice remained calm, edged with wariness. "I haven't done anything. I'm just waiting for my food." Luke's jaw clenched, his patience fraying. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Show me your ID, or I'll take you in." The diner grew quieter, the tension thickening like fog. Sally, the elderly waitress with silver hair pinned in a tight bun, hesitated behind the counter, her hands wringing a dish rag. "Officer Harris," she ventured. Her voice soft but firm, "Ryan's here almost every week. He's no trouble." Luke ignored her, his focus locked on Ryan. "ID, now." With a sigh, Ryan reached into his pocket and handed over his driver's license. "Here. But you're making a mistake." Luke barely glanced at it before stepping closer, his voice dropping. "Stand up." "Why?" Ryan asked, his patience thinning, his dark eyes searching Luke's face for reason. "Don't argue with me." Luke grabbed Ryan's arm, yanking him to his feet with a force that sent a ripple of unease through the room. "Hey!" Ryan protested, pulling back slightly, his voice rising. "You're out of line." The scuffle drew the attention of Judge Ethan Carter, who'd been nursing a cup of coffee in a corner booth, seeking a rare moment of peace. He rose, his tall frame commanding the room, his presence a steady anchor amid the chaos. "That's enough," Ethan said, his voice firm and clear as he stepped between Luke and Ryan. "Officer Harris, what exactly is this man being detained for?" Luke's glare shifted to Ethan, his frustration boiling over. "Stay out of this, Carter. It's police business." Ethan didn't flinch, his gray eyes steady. "As a judge, I have every right to ensure proper procedure is followed. You have no grounds to hold him." Luke's grip on Ryan tightened, his knuckles whitening. "You think you can lecture me about the law? You don't know what it's like out there." "Let him go," Ethan demanded, his tone cutting through the haze of Luke's anger. Ryan seized the moment, his voice steady despite the strain. "I've done nothing wrong. This is harassment." In a flash of temper, Luke shoved Ryan against the counter, the impact rattling utensils and drawing gasps from the onlookers. "You need to shut your mouth," he barked, his control slipping. "Stop." Ethan's command sliced through the room, sharp and unyielding. "This is an abuse of power, and it ends now." The diner fell silent, every eye on the standoff. Luke turned to Ethan, his face flushed with rage. "Don't tell me how to do my job." Ethan stood taller, unflinching. "I'm telling you your behavior is unacceptable. Release him, or I'll report this myself." That was the breaking point. In a surge of unchecked fury, Luke's hand lashed out, striking Ethan across the face with a crack that echoed like thunder. The room erupted in stunned gasps. Ethan stumbled back, his hand rising to his reddened cheek, but he quickly regained his footing, his composure unshaken. "Oh my God," a woman whispered from a nearby table. "That's Judge Carter," another patron muttered, fumbling for their phone. The silence shattered as cameras clicked and red recording lights blinked to life. Luke froze, his chest heaving, the gravity of his actions crashing down on him. Ethan straightened, his voice calm but laced with steel. "You just assaulted a federal judge. Step away now, Officer Harris." Luke's face twisted, a storm of defiance and regret warring within him. Ryan slipped away, moving to stand beside Sally, who clutched her dish rag like a lifeline, her eyes wide with disbelief. The doorbell jingled again, and 3 officers, Barnes's loyal allies, strode in. Their presence heavy with menace. They assessed the scene, then zeroed in on Ethan. "You need to leave, Carter," one growled, his hand resting on his belt. "You're out of your depth." The patrons stirred, some shifting nervously, others rising in quiet solidarity. "I'm not going anywhere," Ethan replied, his voice steady as granite. "You've all just witnessed an officer abuse his authority and commit assault. This will be reported." One of the officers stepped closer, his sneer barely concealed. "Be smart, Judge. You don't want this to escalate." Before he could finish, a young woman in the back called out, "We're recording all of this." Several diners raised their phones. The flashing lights a silent rebuke. The officers faltered, their bravado cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. "You think this is over?" Luke growled. His voice a hoarse whisper as he glared at Ethan. Ethan met his gaze, unflinching. "No. It's just beginning." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, then retreated, muttering curses as they pushed through the door. Luke lingered, his anger a smoldering ember, but the sea of phones and accusing eyes forced him out. The diner erupted in a cacophony of voices as the tension broke, relief and outrage mingling in the air. Ryan turned to Ethan, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you, Judge Carter. I didn't think anyone would step in." "You shouldn't have to feel that way," Ethan replied, his tone gentle but firm, a promise woven into his words. That night, the video of Luke striking Ethan spread like wildfire across the internet, igniting a firestorm of outrage and debate. For Luke, the fallout was immediate and merciless. He stormed into his home, the front door slamming shut with a force that rattled the walls. His face was flushed, his jaw aching from clenching it so tight. The day replayed in his mind in vivid, punishing detail: the slap, the flashing cameras, the cold, unyielding resolve in Ethan's eyes. His wife, Chloe, stood in the living room, arms crossed, her phone gripped tightly in one hand. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she demanded, her voice sharp and unforgiving, cutting through the haze of his anger. Luke stopped short, his breath catching as he faced her. The incident wasn't just a personal unraveling, it was the beginning of a reckoning, a stark lesson in justice and the devastating consequences of power unchecked. For every action, a price would be paid, and the ripples of that day would stretch far beyond the walls of the diner, exposing the rot beneath the badge and the cost of losing one's way. The living room was suffocating, thick with the weight of unspoken words and the jagged edges of broken trust. Luke stood near the kitchen counter, his shoulders rising and falling heavily. Each breath a struggle against the storm raging inside him. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the counter, the cold surface biting into his palms. "I can't deal with this right now, Chloe," he muttered, his voice raw and frayed, as if it had been dragged over gravel. "You don't need this either." But the words felt hollow. A weak attempt to deflect the inevitable confrontation he knew was coming. Chloe's voice sliced through the air like a blade, sharp and unrelenting, her anger a living thing that pulsed between them. "Do you have any idea how many calls I've gotten today? How many messages? That video is everywhere, Luke. My co-workers have seen it. Maggie's friends saw it. The entire world knows what you did." Her words trembled with a fury she could barely contain, her hazel eyes blazing as she stepped closer to him. The hardwood floor creaked under her boots, a small, mundane sound that somehow made the moment feel even heavier. "I didn't start this," Luke shot back, his voice cracking as he flung his keys onto the counter with a metallic clatter. The gesture was sharp, defiant, a physical echo of the frustration boiling inside him. "That judge, Barnes, he humiliated me. He's tearing us apart, Chloe. Don't you see that? Her eyes narrowed, glinting with a mix of disbelief and scorn. She took another step forward, close enough now that he could feel the heat radiating from her. Don't you dare try to justify this, she hissed, her tone low and venomous. You slapped a judge, Luke. In public. In front of cameras. How can you stand there and not see how wrong that was? Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. She wanted to scream, to shake him until he understood the wreckage he'd caused, but her voice stayed steady. A steel thread woven through her rage. He deserved it, Luke spat, his voice shaking with a fury that threatened to spill over. His broad shoulders tensed, muscles coiling as if he were still standing in that diner, facing down Judge Barnes. He's making it impossible for us to do our jobs. He sits up there in his robes, passing judgment like some untouchable god, but he doesn't know what it's like out there. He doesn't know what we face every day. His chest heaved, and his dark eyes burned with a reckless intensity, daring her to challenge him. Chloe's expression shifted, her anger hardening into something colder, more piercing. Do you even hear yourself right now? She asked, her voice dropping to an icy whisper that cut deeper than any shout. You sound like some angry thug, not the man I married. Not the man who promised me we'd build a life together. Her words hung in the air, heavy with disappointment, and for a moment, Luke's fists tightened at his sides, knuckles widening as he wrestled with the urge to lash out. But before he could respond, a softer voice broke through the tension, fragile and trembling, like a thread about to snap. We don't understand because you won't explain, Dad. Both parents turned sharply, their argument suspended as they saw Maggie standing in the hallway doorway. Their 16-year-old daughter looked smaller than usual, her slight frame swallowed by the oversized hoodie she wore. Her eyes were red and swollen, tears glistening on her lashes, and her hands shook as she clutched her phone like a lifeline. The dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across her face, accentuating the hollows under her eyes. Everyone at school is talking about it, she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. Do you know what it's like to walk through the halls and hear people whispering about your dad? Calling him a monster? Maggie, Luke began, his voice softening as he took a tentative step toward her, but she cut him off with a cry that echoed through the room. No. I don't want to hear it. Her words were a jagged sob, torn from a place of deep hurt. You keep saying you're protecting us, but all you're doing is ruining everything. Her brown hair fell into her face as she shook her head, and she swiped at it angrily, tears streaming down her cheeks. Luke reached out, his calloused hand hovering in the air, but Maggie recoiled, stepping back as if his touch might burn her. I can't be here right now, she choked out, grabbing her jacket from the hook by the door. Before Chloe could stop her, she stormed out, the door slamming behind her with a force that rattled the windows. Luke turned to Chloe, his voice breaking as he tried to hold on to some shred of hope. She'll come back. She just needs time. But Chloe shook her head, her expression a storm of anger and sorrow, her lips pressed into a thin line. You don't get it, do you? She said, her voice trembling with the weight of her exhaustion. You've pushed her away. You've pushed all of us away. Her hands fell to her sides, limp and defeated, as she stared at the man she barely recognized anymore. Don't put this on me, Luke shouted, his voice rising to a desperate roar. None of this would have happened if Carter hadn't gone after Barnes. He's the one tearing everything apart. No, Luke, Chloe replied, her tone flat and final, a cold blade slipping between his ribs. This is on you. Your anger, your ego, your refusal to walk away from a fight that's not worth winning. You've destroyed this family. She turned away, her footsteps heavy as she walked toward the stairs, leaving him alone with the echo of her words. Hours later, the living room was a tomb of silence. The only light coming from the flickering glow of the muted television. Luke sat slumped on the couch, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table in front of him. Its amber contents glinting faintly in the dimness. The air was thick with the stale smell of alcohol and regret. On the screen, the diner video played on an endless loop, his hand connecting with Judge Barnes's face, the shock rippling through the crowd, the moment that had unraveled his life. Each replay felt like a punch to his gut, a reminder of the man he'd become. The house creaked occasionally, settling into the night, but the sound only deepened the oppressive stillness. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his haze. He staggered to his feet, the room tilting slightly as he crossed to the entrance. When he opened it, 3 figures stood on the porch. Their silhouettes imposing against the faint glow of the streetlights. They were officers, men he'd worked alongside for years, their faces etched with a grim resolve. Leading them was Officer Dean. A burly man with a jaw like a bulldog and eyes that glinted with barely concealed menace. "What do you want?" Luke asked, his voice slurred and thick, the whiskey dulling the edges of his words. "We need to talk," Dean said, stepping forward without invitation. Luke tried to push the door closed, but Dean's meaty hand shoved it back open, the force sending Luke stumbling backward. "This isn't optional, Harris," Dean growled, stepping inside, his boots thudding heavily on the hardwood floor. The other 2 followed, Calloway, a wiry man with a sharp face and restless energy. And a third officer whose quiet presence felt like a coiled threat. Luke's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching instinctively as he steadied himself. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. His voice rising despite the fog in his head. Dean folded his thick arms across his chest, his stance wide and unyielding. "You screwed up today, but you can still fix it. Show everyone you're not backing down. Take back your honor." His tone was low, edged with a dangerous calm that made Luke's stomach twist. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Though a cold knot of dread was already forming in his gut, tightening with every word. Calloway stepped forward, his thin lips curling into a sneer. "We're going to send Carter a message. A real one this time." His voice was quick and sharp, like the snap of a whip, and his eyes darted between Luke and Dean, gleaming with a restless excitement. Luke's head snapped up. Clarity cutting through the whiskey's haze. "No. Absolutely not," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. Dean leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour as he loomed over Luke. "You don't have a choice. You're either with us or against us. And if you're against us, well, you know what happens to traitors." His words dripped with menace. A promise of violence lurking just beneath the surface. Calloway smirked, his wiry frame practically vibrating with anticipation. "Your family? You think Carter gives a damn about them? He's the reason your daughter's crying herself to sleep and your wife's packing her bags." Dean nodded, his expression hardening. "This is your chance to make it right. To be the man they respect again. Or are you just going to let Carter keep destroying you?" Luke's mind raced, a chaotic swirl of anger and shame. He hated Carter, hated the sanctimonious judge who'd turned his life into a public spectacle, but he hated the reflection staring back at him even more. "Get out," he said through gritted teeth. His voice low and trembling with barely contained rage. Dean's smirk widened, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold, calculating edge. "Have it your way, Harris. Just remember, no one's coming to save you when this all falls apart." The 3 officers turned and left, the door slamming shut behind them with a sound that reverberated through the empty house. Luke stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of their threat sinking into his bones. Meanwhile, across town, the night was still and heavy. The courthouse parking lot bathed in the faint, uneven glow of scattered streetlights. Ethan Carter walked briskly toward his sedan, his shoulders hunched under the burden of the day's events. The air was cool, carrying the distant hum of traffic, but the silence around him felt oppressive, pressing against his ears. His briefcase swung lightly at his side. The leather creaking with each step, a small reminder of the normalcy he longed to reclaim. But as he neared his car, a faint scuffling sound stopped him cold. He turned. His sharp eyes scanning the shadows between the rows of vehicles, but the darkness revealed nothing. Shaking off the unease, he quickened his pace. The soles of his polished shoes tapping against the asphalt. The sound came again, closer now, deliberate footsteps echoing in the quiet. Ethan froze, his hand slipping into his pocket for his phone. His pulse quickening. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady but laced with a tension he couldn't hide. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that swallowed his words. He turned back toward his car, but a flicker in the side mirror stopped him dead, a figure moving fast, closing the distance with predatory intent. Instinct kicked in, and Ethan bolted. His shoes slapping the pavement as he darted between parked cars. His breath came in sharp, ragged bursts, the cold air stinging his lungs. Behind him, heavy footfalls pounded the ground. Relentless and gaining. "Carter," a deep voice barked, the sound sending a shiver racing down his spine. He didn't stop, weaving through the maze of vehicles. His heart hammering as he aimed for the lot's exit. The adrenaline surged through him, sharpening his senses, but the pursuer was close, too close. A sudden, searing pain exploded in his shoulder as something hard struck him from behind. He stumbled, crashing to the ground with a groan, the asphalt scraping his palms as he hit. Twisting around, Ethan saw the man towering over him, a metal pipe gripped tightly in gloved hands. The attacker's face was shadowed, but his voice was a low, guttural growl. "You think you can ruin lives and just walk away?" He raised the pipe again, and Ethan rolled to the side just as it slammed into the pavement with a sharp, metallic clang. Kicking out. Ethan's foot connected with the man's knee, sending him staggering back with a grunt. Scrambling to his feet, Ethan lunged for his car, his trembling fingers fumbling with the key fob. The attacker recovered quickly, grabbing his arm and swinging the pipe toward his ribs. Ethan twisted, the blow glancing off his side but sending him sprawling against the car's hood. Pain blooming hot and fierce. Through the haze, Ethan hit the panic button on his fob. The car's alarm erupted, a piercing wail that shattered the night, the headlights flashing wildly. The attacker flinched, startled by the sudden chaos, and Ethan seized the moment. His fingers caught the edge of the man's jacket near the pocket, and with a desperate yank, he tore a piece free, sending the assailant reeling backward. Not wasting a second, Ethan threw open the car door, climbed inside, and locked it, his chest heaving as the attacker pounded on the window with the pipe. But the sound of approaching voices, drawn by the alarm, made the man pause. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his breath fogging the glass before he turned and melted into the shadows. Ethan sat in the driver's seat, his shoulder throbbing, his ribs aching, his hands shaking as he clutched the torn fabric. In the strobe of the flashing headlights, he squinted at it. His breath catching as he spotted a small badge sewn into the lining, a police department insignia. The realization hit him like a second blow: this wasn't random. This was retribution. Back inside the courthouse, Ethan slumped in a chair, his jacket off to reveal a purpling bruise spreading across his shoulder. Detective Emma Blake stood nearby, her sharp eyes studying the torn fabric he'd handed her. She was a wiry woman with a no-nonsense air, her short hair tucked behind her ears, her fingers tracing the badge with a frown. "You're sure this came from him?" she asked, her voice crisp and probing. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight despite the adrenaline still buzzing through him. "I tore it off during the struggle." He had a police badge sewn into his jacket. His words were steady, but his mind was racing, piecing together the implications. Emma's gaze flicked up to meet his, her expression darkening. "This changes everything," she said, her tone low and resolute. "If they're coming for you like this, Carter, then justice isn't just blind, it's bleeding." The night stretched on, heavy with the weight of choices and consequences. For Luke, the lesson was brutal and clear. Unchecked anger and the abuse of power didn't just destroy the enemy, it tore apart the ones he loved most, leaving him isolated in a wreckage of his own making. For Ethan, the assault was a stark reminder that justice, when wielded without mercy, invited chaos in return. Both men stood at the edge of a breaking point, their lives entwined in a cycle of retribution that promised no victors, only survivors, if they were lucky. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty blinds of Emma Blake's cramped office, casting long, jagged shadows across the worn wooden floor. She stood near her cluttered desk, her brow furrowed in concentration as she held a tattered piece of fabric up to the flickering light of a desk lamp. The faint smell of cigarette smoke clung to it, a lingering trace of its mysterious owner. Her fingers tightened around the edges, her nails digging into the coarse threads as she turned it over in her hands. "Whoever this belongs to. They're tied to Barnes," she murmured, her voice low but laced with a steely determination that cut through the stillness. "This isn't just some random scrap, it's a thread in a much bigger web. If this guy's one of ours, if he's on the force, we'll dig until we find him." Her hazel eyes narrowed, glinting with resolve as she imagined the faceless figure behind this clue. Someone bold enough to leave such a damning hint in their wake. Across the room, Ethan Carter leaned forward in his chair, his broad shoulders tense beneath his weathered jacket. The creak of the old springs under his weight punctuated the heavy silence. He rubbed a hand across his stubbled jaw. His dark eyes locked on Emma as the gravity of her words settled over him like a storm cloud. "They're not holding back anymore," he said, his tone rough with a mix of anger and unease. "This isn't just about sending a message or flexing their muscle, it's personal now. They're stepping out of the shadows, attacking in broad daylight." His mind flashed back to the bruises still blooming across his ribs from the parking lot ambush, each ache a reminder of how close he'd come to something worse. He met Emma's gaze. And in that shared look, a silent pact formed between them, two souls bound by a relentless pursuit of truth. "If they're willing to go this far," she replied, her voice steady despite the flicker of fear in her chest, "then we've got no choice but to hit them harder. We've got the evidence right here, Ethan. It's time to unravel this mess and drag Barnes into the light." Miles away, under the dim glow of a flickering neon sign that buzzed like a trapped insect, Luke Harris sat alone in his beat-up sedan. The air outside the dingy bar was thick with the scent of stale beer and exhaust, a gritty haze that seemed to cling to everything it touched. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened, the leather creaking under the pressure as he stared at the bar's entrance. Inside those grimy walls, he knew Barnes and his tight-knit crew of loyalists were huddled together, plotting their next move. Luke's breath hitched as he pictured them, shadowy figures hunched over a table. Their voices low and conspiratorial, making choices that could shatter lives, including Ethan Carter's. Maybe even his own family's. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. A cold dread that coiled in his gut and refused to let go. For years, Luke had stood by Barnes, a steadfast defender of the man he'd once seen as a brother in arms. He'd brushed off the whispers of dirty tactics, chalked them up to the rough edges of a tough job. But now, as he sat in the growing dusk, those excuses felt flimsy, like paper dissolving in the rain. Sleepless nights had become his norm, his mind replaying the chaos at the diner, the shouts, the shattering glass, the look of betrayal in his wife's eyes when he tried to explain it away. Then there was the mounting pile of evidence, each piece a jagged shard pointing to Barnes's reckless vendetta. This wasn't just bending the rules anymore. It was a plunge into something dark and unforgivable. Enough, he muttered to himself, his voice a hoarse whisper in the empty car. With a trembling hand, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small digital recorder, its cold metal surface a lifeline in the storm of his thoughts. He slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket, feeling its weight against his chest as his heart pounded a frantic rhythm. The car door groaned as he pushed it open, and with every step toward the bar, the line between loyalty and betrayal blurred a little more. Inside, the back room of the bar was a haze of cigarette smoke and muted light, the air heavy with the sour tang of spilled beer. Barnes stood at the head of a scarred wooden table, his broad frame casting a shadow over the half-dozen officers gathered around him, men with hard eyes and clenched fists, their loyalty to him etched into every tense muscle. Empty bottles cluttered the table, some tipped over, their contents pooling in sticky rings. Luke slipped in quietly, his boots scuffing against the sticky floor, and a few heads turned, their gazes sharp with suspicion. "Glad you could make it, Harris," Barnes drawled, his voice dripping with mockery as he flicked ash from his cigarette onto the floor. "Wasn't sure you still had the guts for this." The word stung. But Luke swallowed the retort burning in his throat and took a seat near the table's edge, his face a careful mask of indifference. "What's the plan, Dave?" he asked, keeping his tone even, though his pulse thrummed in his ears. Barnes smirked, a predator's grin that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "The plan's simple, we remind Carter who he's dealing with. Last night's little warning wasn't enough, so next time, he won't walk away so easy." Luke's stomach twisted, but he forced his expression to stay neutral, his fingers brushing the recorder hidden beneath his jacket. "Next time," he pressed, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "You're talking about taking this further?" Barnes leaned forward, his meaty hands splaying across the table as his voice dropped to a menacing growl. "You think we can just sit back while he drags our names through the dirt? He's out there turning us into a laughingstock, undermining everything we've bled for." The room crackled with tension, the other officers shifting in their seats, their eyes darting between the two men. Luke's frustration boiled over, cracking through his calm facade. "Everything we've bled for? Since when does that include jumping a judge in a parking lot or terrorizing his family?" His words hung in the air, sharp and accusing, and the room fell into a stunned silence. All eyes locked on him, some wide with shock, others narrow with distrust. Barnes's smirk vanished, replaced by a glare as hard as steel. "Watch your mouth, Harris," he snapped, his voice low and dangerous. "No, you watch yours," Luke shot back, his voice rising as he shoved his chair back and stood. "You're dragging us all down with this insanity. Every reckless move you make just proves Carter right, you're turning us into the thugs he says we are." The table rattled as Barnes slammed his fist down, the bottles clinking wildly. "Don't you dare lecture me," he roared, his face reddening with fury. "I'm protecting this department, protecting all of you, while Carter's out there trying to tear it apart." Luke didn't flinch, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "You're not protecting anyone, you're destroying us. And for what? Your ego? Your grudge against Carter?" Barnes surged to his feet, towering over Luke, his breath hot and reeking of stale beer. "You've got some nerve, coming in here and questioning me after all I've done for you, for all of us. You think you can just waltz in and play the saint?" "I'm questioning you because someone has to," Luke fired back, stepping closer until they were inches apart, the air between them electric with rage. "This isn't loyalty, it's madness. You're going to get someone killed." Barnes's eyes narrowed to slits, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "Be careful, Harris. We look out for each other here, but there's no room for traitors." Luke held his ground, though his blood ran cold. "Maybe you should look in the mirror, Dave." The only traitor I see is you." For a long, suffocating moment, they stared each other down, the weight of their words pressing against the smoky air. Then Barnes turned sharply to the group, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We stick to the plan. The message needs to be loud and clear: nobody messes with us and walks away." As Barnes ranted on, his words growing more unhinged with every sentence, Luke's hand slipped to the recorder, his thumb pressing the button with a faint click. Each damning syllable Barnes spat: threats against Carter, boasts of their resources, hints at making the judge disappear, was captured. A ticking bomb nestled against Luke's chest. "He's a liability," Barnes growled, his eyes glinting with malice. "We've got what it takes to handle him for good if we need to. He just needs to know we're not playing around." Luke's stomach churned, bile rising in his throat, but he kept his face blank, nodding faintly as if in agreement. He knew the stakes: if anyone caught wind of what he was doing, the room would turn on him in an instant, and there'd be no escape. When the meeting finally dissolved into muttered curses and the clink of fresh bottles, Luke slipped out unnoticed, the cool night air hitting his flushed face like a slap. His hands shook as he climbed into his car, the recorder burning a hole in his pocket. He pressed play, and Barnes's voice filled the silence, each word a nail in the coffin of the man Luke had once trusted. His breath came in shallow gasps as he drove toward the courthouse, the city lights blurring past him in a haze of guilt and resolve. He'd crossed the line Barnes had warned him about, but deep down, he knew it was the only path to stop the spiral of chaos threatening to swallow them all. At the courthouse, Ethan Carter sat hunched over his desk, the dim glow of a single lamp illuminating the papers strewn across it. The bruises from the parking lot attack throbbed faintly, a dull reminder of the violence creeping closer every day. The door creaked open, and he looked up, his tired eyes narrowing as Luke stepped inside, his face pale and drawn. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice thick with suspicion, his hand instinctively drifting toward the drawer where he kept his service weapon. Luke closed the door behind him with a soft click, his movements deliberate despite the tremor in his fingers. "I've got something you need to hear," he said, pulling the recorder from his jacket and setting it on the desk with a quiet thud. Ethan stared at it, his gut twisting with a mix of dread and curiosity, before reaching out to press play. Barnes's voice spilled into the room, raw and venomous, laying bare the depth of his corruption. Ethan's expression shifted as he listened, from wariness to a grim, unyielding understanding. When the recording clicked off, he leaned back in his chair, his bruised knuckles widening as he gripped the armrests. "This is dangerous, Luke," he said, his voice low but firm. "You know that, right?" Luke nodded, his throat tight. "I know. But it's the truth, and it's got to come out." Ethan's piercing gaze bore into him. "Why now? After all this time?" Luke hesitated, then let out a shaky breath. "Because I'm done being part of the problem. I've let this go on too long. It's time to make it right, even if it costs me everything." Ethan studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them. Then he nodded, a flicker of respect breaking through his guarded demeanor. This could bring Barnes down for good. Together with Emma, they began to piece together a plan, the recorder's contents a weapon sharper than any blade. Outside, the city simmered with unrest, the distant roar of a crowd swelling like a gathering storm. From his office window, Ethan watched as hundreds of protesters clogged the street below, their voices a chaotic symphony of rage and hope. On one side, Carter's supporters waved signs scrawled with demands for justice, "No one is above the law," painted in bold red letters, their chants ringing out with fierce conviction. Across the barricades, Barnes's loyalists stood defiant, their banners proclaiming, "Protect our police," flapping in the wind, their shouts laced with desperation and anger. The air was thick with the acrid stench of sweat and gasoline, the heat of the midday sun amplifying the tension until it felt like the street itself might crack open. Riot police formed a fragile line between the factions, their shields glinting like mirrors under the relentless light, their faces hidden behind visors. Emma stood beside Ethan. Her jaw clenched as she surveyed the chaos. "This is spiraling out of control," she said, her voice tight with worry. Ethan nodded, his expression darkening. "It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." As if on cue, a bottle arced through the air, shattering against the pavement with a sharp crack. The sound was a spark in a powder keg. Suddenly, fists flew, and the crowd surged forward, a tidal wave of fury crashing against itself. "Stay back," a riot officer bellowed, raising his shield as a barrage of projectiles, bottles, cans, chunks of broken concrete, rained down. A woman from Ethan's side shrieked as she hit the ground, shoved by a burly man in a "Protect Our Police" cap. Barnes's loyalists pushed through the barricade, tackling protesters with wild abandon, while the police swung batons in a frantic bid to restore order. But their efforts only stoked the flames, the crowd's roars growing louder, more primal. Ethan turned to Emma, his face set with determination. "We can't let this go on." She grabbed his arm, her grip firm. "You go out there, you're a target." He shrugged off her warning, reaching for his coat. "They're already targeting me. If I don't stand up now, who will?" He pushed through the courthouse doors and stepped onto the marble steps. The scene before him a whirlwind of violence and desperation. A can of paint soared toward him, exploding in a splash of crimson across the stone at his feet, but he didn't flinch. Grabbing a megaphone from a nearby officer, he raised it to his lips, his voice cutting through the din like thunder. "Enough." The word echoed, raw and commanding, and for a fleeting moment, the crowd stilled, their eyes turning to him. "You're not helping anyone with this," he said, his tone unwavering. "We're here for justice, not to rip each other apart." A man from Barnes's side jeered, his voice hoarse with rage. "You're the problem, Carter. You started this." The crowd rumbled again, teetering on the edge of eruption, but Ethan held his ground, his presence a beacon in the storm. In that moment, the lesson was clear: justice wasn't just a word on a sign, it was a fragile, hard-won thing, easily drowned by the chaos of unchecked power. Barnes's abuse of authority had ignited this fire, his pride fanning the flames until they threatened to consume everything, his allies, his enemies, and the very system he claimed to protect. Luke's recording, Emma's resolve, and Ethan's defiance were the threads pulling back the curtain, exposing the rot within. The consequences of power wielded without restraint rippled outward, tearing at the fabric of trust and order, leaving a city, and its people, teetering on the brink. But in their stand against it, they offered a glimmer of hope, that even in the darkest corners, the truth could still claw its way free. The air outside the courthouse was thick with tension, a simmering cauldron of rage and desperation threatening to spill over into chaos. Luke Harris stepped out into the daylight, his once proud police uniform clinging to him like a heavy shroud. What had once been a badge of honor, a symbol of his unwavering authority, now pressed down on his shoulders, suffocating him with the weight of his own regrets. Beside him stood Ethan Carter, his expression a mix of resolve and quiet dread. As the crowd before them erupted into a cacophony of noise. From one side, the furious shouts of "traitor" pierced the air, hurled by the loyal supporters of Sergeant David Barnes, their voices raw with betrayal. On the other side, Ethan's allies watched in stunned silence, their confusion palpable, unsure of what Luke's presence meant in this volatile moment. Luke raised his hands, his palms outstretched as if pleading for a chance to be heard. His voice, rough but steady, sliced through the clamor like a blade. "Listen to me," he bellowed. And for a fleeting moment, the roar of the crowd dulled to a murmur, heads turning, eyes narrowing as they strained to catch his words. He took a deep breath. the weight of his confession pressing against his chest. "I've made mistakes, terrible ones," he began, his tone heavy with shame. "I let my anger take the wheel, clouding every decision I made. I hurt people, good people, because of it. But this?" He gestured to the seething mass of bodies before him, the air thick with hostility. "This isn't justice. This isn't loyalty. This is just hate piling on top of more hate, and it's choking us all." Before he could finish, a glass bottle arced through the air from Barnes's side, glinting menacingly in the sunlight. It narrowly missed Luke's head, shattering against the stone steps behind him with a sharp crack that echoed like gunfire. Shards of glass sprayed across the ground, glittering in the chaos. But Luke didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the crowd, unwavering. "Ethan Carter isn't your enemy," he continued, turning to face Barnes's snarling supporters directly. "The real enemy is corruption, the kind that festers when power goes unchecked. It's the abuse that's rotted us from the inside, and I'm done being its puppet." His words hung in the air. Heavy and raw, a plea wrapped in a declaration. A thick silence settled over the scene, broken only by the faint rustle of banners swaying in the breeze. Then, from Ethan's side, a slow clap began, tentative at first, then swelling into a wave of voices rising in support, a chorus of hope cutting through the bitterness. But Barnes's followers erupted in response, their fury boiling over. "You sold us out," a man roared, his face twisted with rage as he hurled a jagged rock. It struck Luke's shoulder with a dull thud, sending a jolt of pain through his body. He staggered, his knees buckling for a moment, but he steadied himself, his jaw clenched. "I'm standing up for what's right," he said, his voice unshaken despite the ache radiating from his wound. "And deep down, you all know that's what we should have been doing all along." Ethan stepped forward, his presence calm but commanding, his eyes sweeping across both factions. "This isn't about picking teams," he said, his voice firm yet weary. "It's about accountability. If we want a future worth living in, we can't keep clawing at each other's throats. We have to start holding the right people to the fire, those who've twisted justice into a weapon for their own gain." His words landed like stones in a still pond, rippling through the crowd. A young woman from Barnes's side hesitated, her fingers trembling as she gripped her protest sign. Her eyes darted between Luke and Ethan, then to the furious faces around her. Slowly, she lowered the sign, letting it slip from her hands to the ground. "He's right," she said, her voice quivering but resolute as she stepped forward, crossing the barricade that divided the two sides. "This isn't justice. This is just noise." Her defiance sparked something, a flicker of doubt in the eyes of others. One by one, more of Barnes's supporters let their banners fall, their clenched fists loosening as their anger gave way to a quiet, uneasy uncertainty. The tide was shifting, the air growing lighter, but not everyone was ready to surrender their rage. From the back of the crowd, a burly man with wild eyes shouted, "Don't listen to them. They'll sell us out to the system." He charged forward, his boots pounding the pavement. But before he could reach the steps, riot police surged in, their shields glinting as they tackled him to the ground. His muffled curses faded beneath the weight of their restraint. Ethan seized the moment, his voice rising above the scuffle. "We can fix this, together. But it starts with stopping this madness right here, right now." The tension began to unravel, the crowd's energy dissipating like smoke in the wind. Riot police moved methodically, dispersing the last of the agitators, their batons tapping against shields in a rhythm that signaled the end of the storm. The courthouse steps lay strewn with debris, shattered glass, crumpled signs. Streaks of paint smeared across the stone like battle scars. Luke stood beside Ethan, his uniform splattered with red and blue streaks, his shoulder throbbing where the rock had struck. "That was reckless," he muttered, glancing at Ethan with a mix of exhaustion and admiration. So was this, Ethan replied, nodding toward the now scattered crowd. His lips twitching with the ghost of a smile. But sometimes, you've got to roll the dice. Luke let out a low chuckle, a faint grin breaking through the weariness etched into his face. What had begun as a protest morphed into something greater, a turning point captured on shaky video footage that spread like wildfire across news outlets and social media. The images of Luke and Ethan standing together, battered but unbowed, became a rallying cry, fueling a relentless push to drag Sergeant David Barnes into the light of justice. Days later, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation, a hive of murmured conversations and restless energy. Spectators crammed into the benches, their faces a mix of curiosity and outrage. While reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching against notepads. Uniformed officers lined the walls, their expressions unreadable, adding to the weight of the moment. At the defendant's table sat Barnes, his broad shoulders squared, his face a stony mask of defiance. His lawyer, Richard Morgan, lounged beside him, exuding an oily confidence. A faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth as he flipped through his notes with practiced ease. Across the room, Ethan Carter sat beside Detective Emma Blake. A sharp-eyed woman whose quiet intensity seemed to anchor the chaos around her. Ethan's gaze bore into Barnes, steady and unflinching, while Luke Harris occupied a separate bench, his posture rigid. His face a storm of resolve and guilt. The judge swept into the room, his black robes billowing like a shadow, and a hush fell over the crowd. "This court is now in session," the clerk announced. His voice cutting through the silence. Prosecutor Marissa Hayes rose, her presence commanding, her dark hair pulled back tightly as she faced the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began. Her tone clear and unwavering, this case isn't just about one man's crimes. It's about a system that's been poisoned by the abuse of power. Sergeant David Barnes wielded his authority like a club. Intimidating, harming, and silencing anyone who dared to challenge him. Today, we'll lay bare the evidence that proves his guilt beyond any doubt, a guilt that's stained this city for far too long. Richard Morgan stood next, his voice smooth as silk but edged with a razor's bite. "The prosecution will try to cast my client as some cartoonish villain," he said, his eyes glinting with disdain. "But they won't tell you the real story. Sergeant Barnes is a scapegoat, a man who poured his life into protecting this city, now being crucified for doing his duty. Their so-called evidence? It's flimsy, circumstantial, and propped up by desperation. Don't let them fool you." The first witnesses took the stand, their voices trembling but resolute. A shop owner, his hands weathered from years behind a counter, recounted the threats Barnes had snarled at him after he'd dared to file a complaint about harassment. "He told me I'd regret it," the man said, his eyes darting nervously toward Barnes. "Said he'd make sure my store didn't last the month." A young man followed, his face still bearing the faint yellow of fading bruises. Describing how he'd been dragged into an alley by officers under Barnes's command, beaten senseless for no reason but their boss's whims. Each story chipped away at the facade of Barnes's defense, exposing the rot beneath his badge. Morgan's cross-examinations were merciless, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Isn't it true," he asked the shop owner, leaning forward with a predator's grin, "that you've tangled with the law before?" The man faltered, his voice dropping. "That doesn't make what he did right," he muttered. Morgan waved a dismissive hand. No further questions. When Ethan took the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath, the air crackling with tension. "Judge Carter," Marissa Hayes began, her voice calm but piercing. "Can you walk us through the events leading up to the parking lot attack?" Ethan straightened, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he recounted the night that had haunted him for weeks. "I was leaving work late," he said, his voice steady despite the memory clawing at him. "I felt someone behind me, close, too close. Then the first blow came, a metal pipe crashing against my arm. We fought, and I managed to rip a piece of his jacket off. It had a police insignia stitched into it. Morgan pounced, his tone triumphant. You claim this attacker was tied to Sergeant Barnes. But did you see his face? Ethan's jaw tightened. No, he admitted, meeting Morgan's gaze head-on. But the evidence, including Barnes's own recorded words, will tie it all together. The courtroom stilled further when Luke stepped up, his uniform traded for a plain gray suit that did little to erase the shadow of his old life. He gripped the edges of the witness stand. His knuckles white, as Hayes approached. Officer Harris, she said, her voice gentle but firm, you were deep in Sergeant Barnes's inner circle. What did you see? Luke swallowed hard. His throat dry as he forced the words out. I was loyal to him for years, he said, his voice low and ragged. I thought we were protecting our own, keeping order. But that loyalty, it blinded me. I watched him order intimidation against Ethan. I heard him laugh about roughing up civilians, saying they deserved it. And I stood there, saying nothing. Hayes tilted her head. Why didn't you speak up? Luke's eyes dropped, shame flooding his face. Fear, he croaked. Fear of what he'd do to me if I crossed him. But that changed when I saw how far he'd go, how he'd destroy anyone in his way. Did Barnes ever mention harming Judge Carter directly? Hayes pressed. Luke nodded, his voice gaining strength. Yes. In a meeting, he called Ethan a liability. Said he needed to be dealt with. That meeting was recorded. Gasps rippled through the room as Hayes retrieved a small digital recorder from the evidence table. Your Honor, she said, holding it aloft, I'd like to submit this into evidence. The judge's nod was curt. Proceed. The recording crackled to life, and Barnes's voice filled the space, cold and deliberate. The judge is a liability. We've got the resources to take care of him for good if it comes to that. Just need to send a message, loud and clear. The words lingered, a chilling testament to his arrogance. Barnes shifted in his seat, his mask slipping as his lawyer hissed urgent whispers in his ear. When the playback ended, Hayes faced the jury, her voice cutting through the silence. This isn't the voice of a protector. This is the voice of a man who twisted his power into a tool for destruction, crushing anyone who stood against him. Morgan leapt up. His tone slick with defiance. That recording proves nothing concrete, it's open to interpretation. Hayes shot back, her eyes blazing. The jury has ears. They know exactly what they heard. Days of testimony piled up, each piece a hammer striking at Barnes's crumbling defenses. In her closing argument, Hayes stood tall, her voice ringing with conviction. This trial is about accountability. Sergeant Barnes hid behind his badge, using it to shield his crimes. Today, you can say enough is enough, justice demands it. Morgan countered with equal fire. His words sharp and pleading. This is a witch hunt, built on shaky evidence and the betrayal of a coward, he said, jabbing a finger toward Luke. Don't let his guilt trip sway you. The jury deliberated for hours, the courtroom thick with anticipation. When they returned, the air buzzed with electricity. On the charge of conspiracy to commit assault, the foreman read. We find the defendant, David Barnes, guilty. Cheers exploded from Ethan's supporters, a tidal wave of relief and triumph, while Barnes's allies sat frozen, their faces pale with disbelief. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder, restoring order as Barnes was led away in handcuffs, his defiance crumbling into a snarl of resignation. Luke lingered by the courthouse steps afterward. The ache in his shoulder a dull reminder of the rock that had struck him days before. Ethan approached, his footsteps quiet on the littered stone. We did it, Ethan said, his voice soft but firm. Luke nodded, his eyes tracing the horizon where the city sprawled beneath a gray sky. Yeah, he murmured. But it's more than that. It's a lesson: power doesn't justify itself. When you abuse it, it comes back to haunt you. Ethan clapped a hand on his shoulder, a rare warmth breaking through. And justice, he added, is what keeps it in check. Together, they stood in the fading light. The debris of the fight scattered around them, a testament to the cost, and the triumph, of standing for what was right. The air was thick with fury and shock as the trial's verdict sank in. A spark that set ablaze a fierce call for change. Ethan Carter and Luke Harris, two men once divided by bitterness, now stood shoulder to shoulder, leading a movement born from the ashes of a city grappling with its own brokenness. They weren't just fighting against the corruption that had festered under Barnes's reign, they were battling the deeper, uglier truth of a system that had shielded him for far too long. Justice, they realized, wasn't a gift handed down, it was a garden cultivated through relentless effort, and its neglect had allowed weeds like Barnes to choke out fairness. On the opening day of the Carter-Harris Community Center, the building pulsed with life, a heartbeat of hope amid the city's scars. Volunteers darted through the halls, their hands busy with purpose, stacking chairs in neat rows, smoothing out flyers with care, and welcoming newcomers with warm smiles. The faint echo of children's laughter drifted from a corner where a group of teenagers huddled, piecing together a presentation on resolving conflicts without fists or shouts. Ethan stood at the auditorium's front, his broad shoulders squared, adjusting the microphone with a tremble in his fingers he couldn't quite hide. Beside him, Luke shifted his weight, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd, a man who'd once worn cynicism like armor now daring to believe in something softer. The room quieted as Ethan's voice cut through the hum. Steady but heavy with meaning. This center, he said, pausing to let the words settle, is more than bricks and beams. It's a vow, a promise to hear each other, to grow together. To claw our way toward a future that doesn't repeat the past. The applause that followed roared like a wave crashing against a dam, but outside, not everyone clapped. Beyond the center's walls, a knot of police officers lingered in the shadows, their faces carved with resentment. Loyal to Barnes, they saw this place as a slap, a gleaming monument to their betrayal. This is a damn farce. One growled, his voice low and bitter, kicking at a pebble on the pavement. They're spitting on everything we built. For weeks, these men had whispered in dark corners, their anger simmering into a plan. To them, the center wasn't hope, it was a threat, a beacon for those who dared question the iron grip they'd held over the streets. Under night's cloak, they moved. A pack of wolves slinking through the quiet. With a crowbar's groan, they forced open a side door, their boots scuffing the floor as they slipped inside. Let's remind them who runs this town. One snarled, swinging his weapon into a table with a crack that split the silence. They tore through the space like a storm, posters shredded, chairs toppled, equipment smashed into jagged pieces. Across the main wall, red spray paint bled into the words, "Traitors die," each letter a jagged wound. Inside, Luke Harris lingered late, his sleeves rolled up as he tidied the supply room. Ethan's son, Noah, a wiry kid with his father's fire in his eyes, wiped down shelves alongside a handful of teenage volunteers. The sharp shatter of glass froze them mid-motion. What the hell was that? Noah whispered, his breath catching, wide eyes darting toward the door. Luke raised a hand, his jaw tight, signaling for quiet. Stay put, he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Grabbing a flashlight from a shelf, he edged toward the main hall, his pulse hammering in his chest. The beam sliced through the dark, revealing chaos, figures cloaked in black, tearing apart what he'd fought to build. Stop! Luke's voice boomed, a thunderclap of authority. The intruders stilled, caught in the light. Before one stepped forward, his sneer twisting his face. "Harris," he spat, "should have guessed you'd be here, still chasing your hero badge." Luke's eyes narrowed as recognition hit, Officer Dean. A man who'd stood by Barnes through every dirty deal. "This isn't the way, Dean," Luke said, his voice steady despite the wreckage around him. "Whatever you're trying to prove, it's a dead end." Dean's laugh was a bitter rasp. "You don't get it, do you? This place mocks everything we bled for." Luke stepped closer, the flashlight casting harsh shadows across the graffiti. "What you're doing isn't fighting, it's breaking. You're not defending honor, you're drowning in spite." Dean's face contorted, rage flaring as another officer lunged, slamming Luke back against a table. The thud echoed, and from the supply room, footsteps pounded. Noah and the teens burst out, defiance in their stance. "Leave him alone," Noah shouted, planting himself beside Luke, his voice trembling but fierce. Dean smirked at the boy. "Got guts, kid. Shame you're following a fool." Luke pushed forward, placing himself between Noah and the intruders, his presence a wall. "Enough," he snapped, his voice a blade cutting through the tension. Even Dean paused, caught off guard by the weight of it. "I've been you," Luke said, his tone raw, almost pleading. "I've let rage and loyalty twist me blind. But this? This is weakness dressed up as strength." Dean gripped his crowbar tighter, his knuckles white, his breath ragged. "Watch yourself, Harris. You're begging for trouble." Luke didn't blink. "Go ahead, swing. It won't erase the truth, you're not saving anything. You're just proving the world right about us." For a moment, Dean wavered, his resolve cracking as the other officers shifted, uneasy. "They're not the enemy," Luke pressed, softer now. "We've got to be better, not rip it all down." Silence stretched, taut and fragile, broken only by the distant wail of sirens creeping closer. "We're out," one officer muttered, tugging Dean's sleeve. Dean's jaw clenched, his eyes boring into Luke's before he spat, "This isn't over," and stormed out, his crew trailing like shadows. Minutes later, the police arrived, their flashlights sweeping the wreckage. Luke leaned against a splintered table, clutching his bruised ribs, his breath shallow. Ethan and his wife, Emma, rushed in soon after, their faces paling as they took in the ruin, shattered glass glinting under the lights, paint streaking the walls like blood. "They were officers," Luke said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Barnes's loyal dogs." Ethan's fists tightened, his eyes dark with resolve. "They want to crush us." Luke straightened, wincing but unbowed. "They won't. We'll fix it. They can't stop what's coming." By dawn, word of the attack had raced through the city, igniting a fire of its own. Volunteers flooded the center, armed with brooms and paint cans, their faces set with quiet defiance. The graffiti vanished under fresh coats of white, broken furniture was hauled away, replaced by donations that poured in from neighbors who refused to let fear win. At a press conference on the center steps, Ethan faced a sea of microphones, his voice steady as stone. "This was meant to tear us apart, to scare us silent. But it's only shown why we need this place, why we need each other. We won't bend. We won't break." Luke stood beside him, bandages peeking from beneath his shirt, a testament to the night's cost. When Ethan passed him the mic, he hesitated, the weight of his past pressing against his chest. "I was part of the rot once," he admitted, his voice low but clear. "But last night, I saw something real, people who won't quit, who won't let hate win. That's power. That's what we're here for." The attack didn't fracture the center's spirit, it forged it stronger. A rallying cry for a community tired of shadows. Ethan and Luke, now bound by more than a shared name on a sign, turned their eyes to a bigger fight. Determined to root out the corruption that had festered too long. Inside the center, life buzzed on, volunteers scrubbed floors, teens rehearsed speeches, and in a small meeting room, a dialogue unfolded. Ethan stood before a mixed crowd, residents and officers, their faces taut with unspoken history. "We're here to listen," he said, his voice a bridge. "Tell me, how has policing shaped your life?" A young mother rose, her hands shaking as she spoke. "My son's 14. 5 times this year, he's been stopped walking home from school. He's terrified. And I'm powerless." Her words hung like a storm cloud. An older officer in the back shifted, his discomfort plain, while a younger one stood, his face flushed with shame. "I used to think those stops were routine," he confessed. "But now I see the damage. I want to change." Across the room, voices rose, stories of pain and prejudice clashing with admissions of guilt and growth. By the session's end, the air softened, a fragile hope taking root. In another room, Luke led officers through a training, a video flickering on a screen, a confrontation spiraling out of control. "This," he said, jabbing at the image, "is what we stop." A rookie raised her hand. Tentative but eager. He could have stayed calm, kept his hands clear. Her words sparked a murmur, a ripple of possibility. Outside, the city watched, waiting to see if justice could rise from the rubble, or if power's abuse would bury it again. For Ethan and Luke, the lesson was clear: true strength wasn't in breaking things apart, but in building them anew, piece by stubborn piece. In the dimly lit training room of the Carter Harris Community Center, Luke Harris stood before a group of police officers. His voice steady and measured, a stark contrast to the chaos he once embodied. "I told him to use calm language instead of raising his voice," Luke explained, nodding thoughtfully as he recalled a recent encounter he'd observed on patrol. His words carried the weight of experience, a man who'd seen the consequences of unchecked aggression firsthand. One officer, a wiry man with a furrowed brow named Jenkins, piped up from the back, his tone curious but edged with skepticism. "And what about body language? I've seen guys lean in too close, practically towering over people. Doesn't that set things off?" Luke's lips curved into a faint, approving smile, his eyes glinting with quiet pride. "Exactly. That's the kind of thing we need to catch in the moment, leaning forward, invading someone's space. It's not just words that escalate, it's the signals we send without even realizing it." His response lingered in the air, a lesson carved from years of mistakes he was determined never to repeat. Eager to drive the point home, Luke clapped his hands together, the sound sharp and commanding, cutting through the room's murmurs. "All right, let's put it into practice. I want a scenario, real time, no scripts." He gestured to 2 officers. One, a broad-shouldered rookie named Torres, would play a frustrated civilian, while the other, a seasoned woman named Hayes with a no-nonsense stare, would practice de-escalation. The room buzzed with anticipation as Torres squared his shoulders, his face twisting into a scowl as he muttered complaints about a fictional traffic stop. Hayes, standing a careful distance away, softened her posture deliberately, her hands open at her sides, her voice low and steady as she responded, "I hear you, sir. Let's figure this out together." Luke watched intently, his arms crossed, occasionally stepping in to adjust Hayes' stance or suggest a gentler phrase. A camera whirred softly in the corner, capturing every moment of the exercise. Later, when a clip of Luke guiding the officers hit social media, it spread like wildfire across the city screens, the comments flooding with praise. "This is what policing should look like." The video's reach stretched far beyond their expectations, a small spark igniting a broader conversation about justice and accountability. Meanwhile, across town in the center's bustling auditorium, Ethan Carter's son Noah and Luke's daughter Maggie were elbow-deep in preparations for a fundraising event. The space hummed with activity as the two teenagers darted between tasks, their movements a chaotic ballet of purpose. Noah, his dark hair falling into his eyes, wrestled with a tangle of streamers. His fingers trembling slightly with nervous energy as he imagined the crowd that would soon fill the room. Maggie, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a shield, directed volunteers with a quiet intensity, her voice barely above a whisper yet firm with resolve. Together, they transformed the stark auditorium into a vibrant haven, banners in bold reds and blues stretched across the walls, proclaiming messages of hope. While tables groaned under the weight of homemade cookies, knitted scarves, and pamphlets detailing the center's mission. The scent of sugar and fresh paint hung thick in the air, mingling with the faint buzz of excitement as students and families began to trickle in. When the event kicked off, Noah took the stage first, his lanky frame silhouetted against the bright lights. He gripped the microphone with both hands, his knuckles widening as he fought to steady his voice. "We're here because we believe in this place," he said, glancing at Maggie for reassurance. She nodded subtly, her hazel eyes shining with encouragement, and stepped forward when it was her turn. Clutching a crumpled note card, Maggie inhaled deeply, her chest rising as she summoned the courage to speak. "We can't erase what's happened," she began, her voice soft but piercing, carrying across the room like a gentle wave. "All those years of mistrust, the pain, it's real. But we can learn from it. We can build something better, something where fear doesn't win, where people actually listen to each other." Her words struck a chord, raw and unguarded, and the crowd erupted into applause, a thunderous roar that shook the rafters. Local reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing as they immortalized the moment. By morning, photos of Noah and Maggie, standing side by side, their faces alight with determination, splashed across social media, drawing a swell of support for the center's vision. The Carter Harris Center's work soon caught the eye of national news outlets, its story unfolding on screens across the country. A polished segment showcased Luke's training sessions, the camera panning over officers practicing patience and restraint, their faces etched with focus. The narrator's voice praised the center as a lighthouse in a city battered by division, a place where wounds were acknowledged rather than ignored. In one clip, a journalist cornered Ethan Carter outside the center, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. "Judge Carter," the reporter pressed, thrusting a microphone toward him. "What's the endgame here?" Ethan paused, his gray eyes narrowing as he considered the question. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, then spoke, his voice gravelly but resolute. "Reform. Trust. Change. This isn't about picking winners and losers, it's about moving forward, all of us, together." His simplicity cut through the noise, a quiet power that resonated deeply. The coverage sparked a surge of donations, checks stuffed into envelopes, online pledges pouring in, and volunteers flocked to the center, their footsteps echoing through its halls as it solidified its place as a pillar of renewal. Yet not everyone was swayed. In the precinct, a handful of officers grumbled in the break room, their voices low and bitter as they sipped lukewarm coffee. "This is all just optics," one muttered, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "They don't get what it's like out there." Outside, a vocal pocket of the community echoed their doubts, whispering that the police were only playing nice for the cameras. Ethan and Luke felt the resistance like a cold wind at their backs, a reminder that trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. One evening, as they sat in Ethan's cluttered office reviewing the week's progress, Luke leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "We've made real strides," he said, his tone heavy with fatigue, "but the pushback, it's not going anywhere." Ethan, hunched over a stack of papers, nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of a report. "Real change is a grind, Luke. It's messy, it's slow. But look at us, we're still here, still in the fight." That's what counts. Their resolve hardened in that quiet moment, a shared determination to push their city toward something greater, a model for reform that could ripple nationwide. The center's grand celebration arrived with a burst of life, the auditorium swelling with a diverse tapestry of faces, officers in crisp uniforms, families with restless kids. Community leaders in pressed suits. Banners fluttered overhead, their bold letters spelling out justice, unity, and building bridges not walls, each word a defiant promise. On the main stage, Ethan and Luke stood shoulder to shoulder, two men whose paths had once diverged sharply now united in purpose. Ethan stepped to the microphone first, his presence commanding yet warm. Like a father addressing his kin. "This center isn't just brick and mortar," he said, pausing to let the crowd lean in, the silence thick with anticipation. "It's a symbol, a testament to what happens when we refuse to let fear tear us apart. Together, we've proven change isn't a dream, it's a choice." The applause crashed over him like a wave. Hands clapping in a rhythm that pulsed with hope. Luke followed, his steps hesitant as he approached the mic. He scanned the sea of faces, his gaze softening when it found his wife, Chloe, and Maggie near the front. Chloe's steady smile anchored him, while Maggie's nod urged him on. "I've made mistakes," he began, his voice rough with emotion, cracking slightly under the weight of memory. "I'm not proud of who I was, arrogant, reckless. But standing here now, I can promise you this, every single person in this room, in this city, deserves dignity. And those of us who wear the badge? We're here to serve with honor, not to dominate." His words hung heavy, a vow etched in the air, and the crowd surged to their feet, their cheers reverberating off the walls. Together, Ethan and Luke gripped oversized scissors, their hands steady as they sliced through a bright red ribbon. With a single snip, the new training wing opened, a tangible step into a future shaped by accountability. Outside, the celebration spilled into the courtyard, where a tarp fluttered dramatically to the ground, unveiling a mural that stopped the crowd in its tracks. Designed by Noah and Maggie, the artwork burst with color, Ethan and Luke clasped hands at its center, framed by the words justice and unity. Around them, figures of officers, students, parents, and elders stood together, their faces alive with possibility. Noah, his chest swelling with pride, adjusted his glasses as he watched strangers trace the mural's lines with awe. Maggie, standing beside him, brushed a strand of hair from her face, her smile soft but fierce. A journalist elbowed through the crowd, recorder in hand. "Maggie, what's this mean to you?" he asked. She took a slow breath, her eyes drifting over the painted figures. "It's proof," she said, her voice steady now, "that no matter how broken things get, we can fix them. People can grow. Communities can heal, if we're brave enough to try." Nearby, Sophia Carter and Chloe Harris lingered under the mural's shadow, watching Noah and Maggie guide a gaggle of younger kids through the center. Sophia's voice trembled with a mix of awe and exhaustion. "They've really stepped up, haven't they? After everything." Chloe nodded, her arms crossed tightly as if holding herself together. "A few months ago, I couldn't imagine us standing here, talking like this. Now look at them, and us." Sophia let out a soft laugh, her eyes crinkling. "I didn't think I could forgive. But if they can, I suppose we can too." Chloe extended her hand, and Sophia clasped it firmly, a silent truce sealed in the golden light of late afternoon. As the event drew to a close, Ethan and Luke stood outside, the center glowing behind them like a beacon in the fading sun. The crowd thinned, voices fading into the distance, leaving the two men in a rare pocket of stillness. Ethan glanced at Sophia and Noah, their laughter mingling with Chloe and Maggie's as they packed up stray decorations. He turned to Luke, his voice low but warm. "We've come a hell of a long way, haven't we? Luke's gaze drifted to the horizon, his jaw tightening as memories flickered behind his eyes, years of regret, of bridges burned. I didn't think we could, he admitted, almost to himself. Not after what I put everyone through. But you saw something worth saving when I couldn't. Ethan smirked, a dry edge to it. You didn't make it easy, that's for damn sure. Luke chuckled. The sound rough but genuine. Guess not. But I'm glad you stuck with it, with me. Ethan clapped a hand on his shoulder, firm and steady. We're not finished. There's plenty left to mend. But this? This is a damn good start. Inside, Noah and Maggie rallied the last of the kids for one final task. They handed out colorful paper leaves, urging the children to scribble their dreams for the future. The air filled with the scratch of crayons as a boy with tousled hair wrote, "I hope we can all be friends." His tongue poking out in concentration. A girl in pigtails added, "I want my dad to come home safe every night," her letters wobbly but fierce. Maggie watched them pin their leaves to a wire tree sculpture, its branches sprawling with tiny bursts of color. She nudged Noah, her voice barely audible. "This is it, isn't it? The whole point." He nodded, his eyes bright. "Yeah. Giving them something to hold on to, proof things can get better." As the sun dipped below the skyline, casting the center's mural in a warm, amber glow. The message was unmistakable: change starts with those willing to face the hard truths. Ethan and Luke's story, woven with missteps, redemption, and an unrelenting push for justice, showed that even the widest chasms can close when courage meets accountability. The lesson lingered in the air, sharp and clear: power, when abused, fractures trust, but when wielded with honor, it can mend what's broken. Their city stood on the cusp of something bigger. A testament to what's possible when people dare to rebuild, not just for themselves, but for the generations watching, waiting, and dreaming of a world worth believing in.